Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's been so long. It's like, what am I doing? Who am I teaching? About an hour ago, I was like, did I put up notes for today? Like, I had no memory of having done it last week. That's how long ago it seems like it's been. But that's all right. I did do it, as it turns out. So we have our creepy screen. We are live on the YouTube. And we're coming to an end. So we're final push of the semester. We have new lectures and one last example to do over the course of the next 2 weeks. You have one homework that is due this Friday, and then your last homework is due at the end of finals week. So it's not exactly a final, although it is cumulative in the sense that it uses everything that you've used, that you've learned up to this point. I will point out that the Monday of finals week, I'm having just an open lab day that afternoon, so if you have homework questions or you want to come work on it, please come in. Otherwise, I'll just sit here and do my email like usual. Speaking of homework, how is homework 7 treating you? It's not treating you? It's not treating you well, or it's not treating you? It's not treating you well. Would you like to talk about it? Yes. Would anyone like to talk about it? Estimate statements. Okay. Can you rephrase that in the form of a question, please? Mm-hmm. It's kind of tricky, yes. Yes, it is tricky. Let's see. So which section are you working on here? Yeah, so section 1 is a main effects model. So that one should go relatively well. I will tell you, if you have the right answers except for you have the wrong intercept, that means you have centered your variables incorrectly. That's what that means. So double check that you have followed the instructions with respect to where things should be centered. The easy group should be the reference. Spatial ability should be centered at 10 and verbal ability at 30. So, yes. How do you do the reference? Opponent in this data set 2. So easy is 1 and hard is 2. So an easy way to do it is just to subtract 1. And then easy is the 0 and hard is the 1. And you don't have to use the class statement. So when I put this together, I didn't use the class statement because it's a binary variable. So you can if you want to, but then you just have to change your codes to make sure that everything is still with respect to easy being 0. Does that make sense? Just subtract 1. There's your short answer. Then it's 0, 1 instead of 1, 2, and all is well. So that's the main effects model. Then we added two-way interactions, right? Questions on section 2. No, it's section 3. Is that the one that's giving people fits? Yeah. Tell me about it. Mm-hmm. Aha, okay. So number 3 here, estimate a model that examines how opponent moderates the extent to which the effect of verbal ability depends on spatial ability. That's a great sentence, isn't it? So I'm trying to put a statistical term into English here, so let's decompose this. The effect of verbal ability depends on spatial ability. That part of the sentence, what does that mean? That's moderation, but specifically moderation of what by what? How the effect of verbal ability depends on spatial ability. Which one is the slope in the sentence and which one is the moderator? Spatial is the moderator, verbal is the slope. So that's a two-way interaction right there, that piece of the sentence. Then if we back that up, how opponent moderates blah, 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 blah. So how opponent moderates a two-way interaction creates what? A three-way interaction. The fact that you have a three-way interaction in the model then requires how many main effects? 3. How many two-way interactions? Is it? Not a trick. 3, right? So you have to make sure, first off, in terms of what's in the model, that everything is included that's in that list. To remind you, a shortcut to do this in SAS that I have deliberately not taught you up to this point to try and drill in this idea. So like if we have, basically, if we write out what's in the model, I'll put intercept in parentheses because that's included by default. And then we have easy versus hard, right? You have spatial, excuse me, let's go verbal, spatial, and then you have all of the interactions, right? So you have easy hard by verbal, easy hard. You can't put the slash in your variable names, by the way. This is just sort of conceptual, what I'm doing here. And then verbal and spatial, there we go. That's the one I'm missing. That's the two ways, right? Spatial, and then all of the above. There, right? So you could type all of that, or alternatively, you can type bar, bar. Replacing the stars with bars in SAS syntax for fixed effects, that says, give me all possible main effects and lower order interactions up to the three-way interaction, because there's 3 variables there joined by bars. So if you type just that last thing, that's everything. So you could do, since you can't do slashes, you could do something like that, for instance. Okay. So Ejin, does that help with question 1? Okay. Now, question 2, how do I know which things get multiplied and how do I know which things get ones? Okay. The thing that gets a 1 is whatever word follows effect of. So these are all worded in a parallel way to try and emphasize the idea that there's a pattern here. So effect of whatever, that's the term that gets a 1. So for instance, if I say effective verbal by spatial, that two-way interaction is the unit of request for the estimate statement. That gets a 1. Anything attached to it, such as opponent, gets the value for which you want to plug in opponent. Easy versus hard, 0 versus 1. In contrast, if I go down here, for instance, effective verbal ability, that means verbal. Every time you see that, that gets a 1. Anything that's not verbal, that's attached to it, gets a value plugged in as requested by the question. Okay. Is that better? Some of these are going to be things that show up by default, and some of these are things you have to ask for. So, other questions? So everyone's sort of looking sad and staring at their computers. Is this making you feel bad that this is hard? Is that what it is? Or is it just like Monday? Can I tell you a story about where this homework came from? Would that make it better? Maybe? It's a story about how dumb I am, actually. So does that help? So all of my homework has stories, right? All of these hypothetical studies are conducted at Midwestern State University, which covers pretty much everywhere I've ever worked. And this particular story is about a vacation that I took with my husband several years ago. We went and got an Airbnb in, what was it? Sanibel, Florida, in the middle of winter. And we stayed at this one-bedroom condo that was owned by these really old, very nice people, and they left us all kinds of stuff to do, including board games, one of which was Scrabble. So we learned how to play Scrabble. I had never actually played it before, if you can believe that. I was like, 35 or something, and I'd never played Scrabble. I was not good at it. Let's just put it that way. I'd like to think of myself as reasonably verbal, but the idea of like saving your cue to place it on the triple, like that was just beyond me, the spatial component of it, really. And so we played like every night, and I didn't get any better. And then in February, we went to a resort hotel, again in Florida, which was the Tradewinds out in St. Pete's Beach. We went there actually for a business conference. I had to go to a mid-year meeting of this society that I was part of the executive board, and he went along for the ride. So it was a beautiful Saturday afternoon in February. It was like 80 degrees, perfect weather. I spent the day inside a hotel, freezing in the air conditioning, arguing with people about shit that didn't matter, right, as typical executive committee things. And he spent the day at the beach drinking rum runners, which is a glass about, yay full, about 80% of which seems to be alcohol with a little bit of some sort of Kool-Aid or something mixed in. So 4 o'clock rolls around and he comes back to the room and he's like, "Hey, baby." And I'm like, "Hey, how many of those rum runners did you have?" He's like, "It's fine." And so at that point, we had discovered Words with Friends on our phone. We didn't have a Scrabble board with us. And so we were just sort of hanging out in the room, and he was lying on one of the beds in the room and I was sitting on the other, and he was like playing Words with Friends and literally passing out in between turns, right? And he was still kicking my ass. That's the thing. Like, he was beating me by like 200 points or something. It was ridiculous. And at one point, after he played like yet another 70-point word, I got really frustrated. And I'm like, "You're almost unconscious. How are you still beating me?" He's like, "I'm fucking gifted." So that's my favorite story. My husband is fucking gifted. That merits an F-bomb. I'm sorry, it does. But part of the reason that he is so gifted is that he has great spatial ability. So he can see where to put the letters and not just have the good verbal ability to come up with good words that make use of Q's and Z's and other sorts of things. So it's the combination of the two. Whereas if you're somebody like me who has decent verbal ability but terrible spatial, I can't ever see where to put my words. So I end up like hoarding all of my letters because I can't figure out where to put them, and I get a terrible score. So I am pretty bad at Scrabble and Words with Friends, although I've improved, and that is the story behind the story. How's that? So you can all be effing gifted too, but just with estimate statements instead. Because unlike Scrabble, there is a right answer here, and the box will turn green when you get to it. And if not, let me know how I can help. How's that? Any other questions on this before we change topics? Yes, I have not. There are gender differences?
Yeah, because of how men practice because they want to win.
Well, I wanted to win too, but it wasn't going to happen. I can beat my mom. That's the only person that I can beat. I beat him with approximately a type 1 error rate. About 1 in 20 games I win. So it is what it is. Well, yes, if you can send me the link, I would like to read about that, but yes. So yes, verbal and spatial ability interact in important ways in your homework assignment. There's your story. So back to something I actually feel like maybe I am good at, and that's only because I've spent 20 years practicing it. Practice makes perfect. 10,000 hours or something like that. Isn't that the refrain? So I thought before we dive into the next section, we'll do a little review. How do you approach a brand new set of longitudinal data? I know several of you are starting to go through this on your own. So I just wanted to review basically what we've talked about in a series of steps so that you can have a recipe, a guidebook to help you figure out where to go based on models for longitudinal data. So this is lecture 7A. And I have it divided into steps that you would go through for any kind of longitudinal data, and then based on whether you have data that are focused on systematic change Another set of steps versus data that don't show change in which you're interested in fluctuation, the last set of steps here. All right, so here we go. So step 1, find out if you have longitudinal data. Intraclass correlation is a descriptive statistic. It does several things. This comes from an empty means random intercept model. Couple homework questions that I've gotten about based on setting up random intercept models. There are 2 different ways in SAS syntax or any other syntax to specify this model. They are equivalent. They look different in terms of syntax, but putting them together is what people are getting tripped up by. Number 1 is to use only a repeated statement, use only an R matrix, and tell it that it's type CS. That's the compound symmetry version, where you're telling SAS, put all of the variance in the R matrix, make the diagonal part random intercept and part residual, and make the off diagonal random intercept. Equivalently, you can change to a type equals VC R matrix, which is just the diagonal residual variance and nothing else, and have a random intercept, in which case you put the random intercept part in G, E goes in R. When you put them back together again in V, it looks like compound symmetry. What you can't do is put them together where you both have UN or CS. So I'm seeing things that look like this. Random intercept, type equals UN, subject equals ID, for instance, and then something like repeated, occasion or wave, whatever the variable is called in the example. Type equals UN, subject equals ID. If you try to do this, it's going to throw up at you. You will get dots or it won't converge at all. What this is doing is on the repeated line, you're telling it to make it unstructured where everything gets to be what it wants, and then you're asking for a random intercept too. You can't have everything be what it wants and one more. So if what you want is a random intercept model, these 2 letters down here on the R matrix are changed to VC. So this combination gets you a random intercept in G, and I'll put the letters here just to remind you what you're talking about when you ask for these things, and a diagonal that has E variance on only with no covariance whatsoever. I'll make that capital too. Alternatively, you can do, actually let me paste it like this. This. So it's one set or the other. They both do the same thing. It's a semantic distinction how SAS reads this code, but they both end up with a combined prediction that is compound symmetry, random intercept only. In the examples, if you start with the ones that have a random intercept, generally speaking, I do it this way because this is the point then where you end up putting like other slopes in. And this tends to say VC unless tested otherwise. Okay. So this is regardless of what's on the mean side. If I tell you to put saturated means random intercept, it's still this way for the random intercept part. What goes in the means model is what goes in the model statement. So we'll throw that in here. Model outcome equals nothing if it's empty means, right? Solution. And if it's saturated means, then we pick up whatever the variable is that is to be treated as categorical, and it goes on the class statement. Also on the class statement would be the subject identifier. Make that capital. Why not? So we have empty, saturated, empty, saturated. Okay. So empty means random intercept. Step 1, find out if you have longitudinal data. So this is partitioning your variance into its minimum that you would need for longitudinal data. It's likely not going to be adequate, but it's a starting point. So you're finding out how much is between person and how much is within person. Do we need to do the vocabulary? Between is level 2 or 1? 2. Between is residual variance or random intercept variance? Random. It's U or it's E? U. It is inter or intra? Inter. So yes, we are trying to figure out, of the total variation in your outcome, how much is the full list? Level 2, between person, random intercept, cross-sectional, mean differences, inter-individual variation. That's the numerator of the ICC. Versus residual variance, level 1, within person, longitudinal, intra. So the total is the denominator, the numerator is between. That gives us our interclass correlation, which is the proportion of variance that's level 2 cross-sectional between person because of mean differences that would have been there in a cross-sectional study. It's also the expected correlation across time from the same person or same sampling unit. And I've asked you this a couple times in homework now, it's an effect size. So we can test whether or not we have between person random intercept variance. That's a likelihood ratio test against a model that doesn't have it. The ICC is then the effect size that goes with it. Okay, so if there is this between person dependency because of constant mean differences, how much is it? What proportion of the variation is responsible? It's responsible for. So what interclass correlation then is game over for your longitudinal model? 1. Anything less than 1, play ball. However, how much of your variation is at each level is going to tell you which kind of predictors are going to be relatively more important. If I had an intraclass correlation, say, of 0.8, that means 80% of my variance is between person. I'm going to need person information to capture that. Why do people start out higher or lower? That's all we know so far. Potentially, why do people change differently? That's another question we may have. Versus if I have an interclass correlation of 0.2, then most of my information is time varying, and I need time varying predictors to capture that. The only type of predictor that we have examined in this entire semester is time. And so far, in every example, time has been which kind? Between or within? I'm hearing both. So level 2 is between person, right? Level 1 is within person. Which one is time? It's level 1. And in the examples that you've seen so far, time is exclusively level 1. One of the first things we'll do next semester is look at instances in which time is actually both. Whenever you have a sampling design in which people differ in time at the beginning, then you have to worry about time as both a between persons predictor and time as a within persons predictor. So far, it's been only within. So, on that note, what we have done is the first one here in thinking about what should time be. I've done occasion of study, session in the examples, or just 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what I tend to do by default because it can't be wrong. It tracks how much you've changed from when you started. Why you've changed is a separate question because time is not an explanatory variable, but it tracks what happens. There are other ways you might think about tracking time, such as a function of chronological age, grade in school, time within some sort of process, like how long you've been married or how long you've had a disease or even how long it is until you die. There are all kinds of ways to track time relative to some certain point. The point being just when you walked in the door is one option, and that's the one that I tend to favor most for reasons we'll talk about later. This is chapter 10 in the book, by the way. Step 3 then, where do you want your intercept? Meaning, where is time 0 going to be? You pretty much can't screw this up. Different versions of time 0 will still result in equivalent model fit, equivalent predictions. It's a different interpretation. Where you can potentially go wrong is if you pick a point in time that is so far away from your data that it can't find random intercept variance at that point. Otherwise, any time 0 is as good as the next. It's just about interpretation. It tends to be within the scale of the data that you've observed, though. Then, pictures. Always pictures. If time is balanced, this is easy. You get your saturated means model, where you put in as many fixed effects as you have occasions. So if you put time, such as occasion here in this little set here, if I have occasion and I put it here, that gives me as many means as I have occasions. That's the answer key. You make a picture of what it predicts for each occasion, and that's the function that you're trying to capture. If you have the ability to do so, it's useful to have an unstructured R matrix to go with it, because that is the answer key for the variance side. That's not always possible. If it's not possible, then it may be that you have to stick with the random intercept on that side. But the idea is to figure out what is the pattern of mean change. Let's see, that's not what I want. Here. If time is not balanced, then you may have to round it into some kind of convenient interval just to make a picture to get a sense of where the function should go and what shape it should take. I would still recommend using exact time for your analysis. One side note here. You can just ask for the means at each occasion, and if you have complete balanced data, you will get the exact same information as if you ran saturated means. The difference is when you have missing data, these may not agree. So for instance, some of the examples that I have are with older adult data, where by the end of the study, only 25% of the cases are still around. The mean of that 25% that's left is not going to be the same mean that you would get if you asked SAS to estimate means for each occasion. The means that come from SAS out of a saturated means model using maximum likelihood or restricted maximum likelihood, those are the means as if the data were complete. It's trying to capture what the means would be for a complete data set. That's missing at random. We're going to talk more about that today, actually, what that means. Whereas if you just run descriptives and you get the means that are in the data for the people who are left, that's assuming completely at random. So what the model is trying to fit is the missing at random version, the saturated means version. So I would report those. They are estimated means is the way I would refer to them, because they're not real. They are predictions to the extent that you have incomplete data. The same would be true if you did multiple imputation and then you ran descriptives. Those are still ultimately predictions. Yeah. This is for balanced data. Yeah, if you have unbalanced data, I don't think it's reasonable to come up with means, because it's like for whom is that the mean? Because there's an infinite set of possible means that would describe each person. Okay. So here is a schematic to try and help you sort out kinds of data and choices for what to do with respect to time. So there's a continuum ranging from, we'll say, fluctuation on the left to pure within-person change on the right. So if you have a study with time points that are far apart in time, and the whole point is to capture change in some process, then that's the right-hand side. That's a clear-cut case in which you would have some sort of fixed slopes with respect to time, and you would see to what extent those slopes need to be random across level 2 units, across people. On the left-hand side would be pure fluctuation, where you're just asking people what happens, say each day or each hour. You didn't try to change anything, you're just looking at within-person variation. In that case, time may actually be irrelevant. It may not matter if it's time 1 or time 2 or time 20. And in that case, on the variance side, most likely the alternative covariance structures would serve you well. For instance, having a random intercept plus some kind of pattern of correlation in the R matrix, like AR1 or some kind of reduced topolets, would probably describe the relationships over time, and then you'd go about adding your predictors. And then there's the middle case, where either time was not supposed to be relevant, but it is, or you were supposed to see change, but you don't have any. It is entirely appropriate and possible that you may need to combine these two families of models to get something that makes sense. So let's say that I have a piecewise model. Let's see, whose piecewise model is that? Alex? Is that yours? Where are you? Are you here today? Yes. I'm like, where is she? Raise your hand. You're hiding behind your computer. So you have the tornadoes, right? Yes? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Damn it.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not.
No, you're not. But see, this is the thing. I know your data and I can't remember your damn name. You're Maddie.
Yes.
Ugh. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So this is, I got to draw here. Let me break out the paint. Can I tell you about the tornadoes?
Sure.
Okay. So she has a case where, what are we measuring? Like depression, badness? Parenting. Oh, parenting. Excuse me. That's someone else's study. So parenting goodness.
Sure.
So the y-axis is like more is better.
Yeah.
So here's some people in her study, and they're like, do-to-do, and then here's the next occasion, do-to-do, and then there's some people that were like, do-to-do, oh shit, there's a tornado, ah! Is that about right? Okay, just making this up. So you have 3 occasions, and you're interested in how people who got hit by a tornado differ from people who don't. And so they were probably the same or the same-ish before it happened, and then at time 2, the tornado had happened, and now they're different, right? So you expect, and I'm guessing based on your initial data description, that you would have some sort of fixed slopes for time, right? So this is a classic example of a piecewise model, where you would put in one slope for the change pre-tornado to post, and then another slope from post to after post, right? Follow-up or whatever you want to call it. But given that you only have 3 occasions, how many of those slopes could be random? You know the answer. Does anyone else know? With 3 occasions, how many of those slopes could be random? How many does she get? Just the 1. She can have a random intercept, but she can only have 1 random slope. She doesn't have enough degrees of freedom to have 2. So given that you would have to assume compound symmetry for one half of the model or the other, the only reasonable alternative, and the thing that I said she should do, is just fit an unstructured R matrix and be done. That's as good of a variance model as you can ever have. And with 3 balanced occasions, it's not that intensive, and it makes sure that if your variances and covariances need to be different, you do it directly rather than trying to get random slopes to do it for you. So that's kind of a hybrid sort of model. Another example of this is studies I've seen that are ostensibly measuring fluctuation, but in which there's some time trends that sneak in. Have I told you guys about the phone study where you're asked about stressful events? But I told you that one? No? Okay, real study. There was a study of daily experience, as it's known, in which people got called up every night. This was before Palm Pilots and smartphones and all that kind of stuff. And they got asked a question like, hey, did anything stressful happen to you today? And if you said yes, you got 10 minutes worth of follow-up questions about what happened and how you felt about it and all that stuff. Well, by the end of the week, on the 7th day, people were like, did anything happen? Nope, I'm fine. Okay, bye. Because you get paid the same either way. So the plot of like frequency of stressful events across days of time went because people realized that they got off the phone quicker if they lied. So they weren't supposed to be reducing stress, but that's what it looked like happened. So even though changes in stress was not the point of the study, they showed up anyway. So even though there wasn't necessarily a theoretical expectation or explanation, because time ends up being relevant, you got to put it in the model. Another example of when this happened, and this requires paint. Where's paint? There it is. Paint's better than drawing on the board, right, with my crappy markers that never work? I think so. I don't have a fancy tablet to draw on, I'm sorry. I'm kind of old school that way. I listen to 80s music and I draw in paint. So there was another student in my first class at Penn State who was looking at drinking behavior in college students. Sure. And they were interested in a variable called intent to drink. Each week, how many drinks do you think you're going to consume? And they had a cohort of, they had a data set that sort of looked like this on average, and there were all these like little curves like this in there. And this was over the course of the semester, maybe 12 weeks or something. And she ended up trying initially to fit a quadratic function, because this is what it looked like, and trying to think about reasons why people would intend to drink more, but then their intent would go down and had to do with stress in the semester and exams, and nope. Do you know what caused this? They had an enrolling study where 3 different cohorts, where one of the cohorts, this was spring break, another this was spring break, and another this was spring break. So when they actually plotted the data as a function of spring break, it looked like this. That was the mean. There was no quadratic. It was like, I'm going to be fine, I'm going to be fine, I'm going crazy, now I have to go back to school and I'm going to be fine. Interestingly though, you could see individual trends where there were some people that literally peaked at like 60 drinks or something, and others that were like, meep. And others, like me, who chose to work more over spring break rather than going anywhere, and who didn't have money to drink because I was a poor college student and my parents didn't believe in funding my alcoholism. So what she ended up doing is just putting in a dummy code for whether or not it was spring break. So think about that in terms of what we know about fixed and random. What would a fixed effect of that dummy code indicate? The outcome is intent to drink. How many drinks are you going to have this week? What would a fixed effect tell you? Let's say the fixed estimate was 10. And the intercept was 4. Let's make some shit up. What would you do with a model like that? Whether or not it's spring break is the variable. It has a fixed effect. It's a dummy code where 0 is not spring break, 1 is spring break. If I told you the fixed intercept was 4 and the coefficient for that dummy code's fixed effect was 10, what does that tell you? Yep, when it's not spring break, the average amount of drinks people predict themselves to consume is 4. However, it goes up by 10 when it's spring break. Now, what would a random effect of spring break look like? Could I do that? It's weird to think about it as a random slope, but that's exactly what it is. Rather than change over time, it's the difference between regular behavior and vacation behavior. So what would a random effect of spring break be interpreted as? Somebody besides you. Thank you for playing now. Do I have to call on people? Charlie, sitting there in the back. What would a random effect of spring break tell me? Yes, he said the amount of individual variability in the amount of drinking before spring break relative to spring break, or people differ in just how crazy they plan to go. That's how I would phrase it. And she ended up having a random intercept and a random slope for spring break and being able to predict those things with time invariant personality types of traits, as well as other things like Greek membership and whatnot. So instances of time sort of sneaking in there when you didn't expect it. That's the theme. Whenever you don't have random slopes for time, you can still think about other ways of making sure that the variance-covariance structure for time is right with respect to alternative covariance structures. Random intercept only is a very restrictive structure. You may need something in the R matrix to go with it if you don't have random slopes for time. Thoughts, questions? Okay. So then, if you have systematic change, if you're in the type of study where the time is the point and you're trying to measure individual differences in change, these are the things to think about. Model for the means. That's the fixed effects of time. That's the average trajectory. What kind of shape does it have? Is it continuous or discontinuous? Discontinuous is a piecewise type of idea. Do you have phases of a study in which different things happened? That's a piecewise type of model. Or do you just have one continuous trend that may or may not be nonlinear? We talked about various kinds of nonlinear. We talked about quadratics, for instance, in cubics. On the pro side, quadratics and cubics can be easily implemented in software. You take time and square at the end. Every package can do that. On the negative side, quadratics imply that what goes down must come up and vice versa. So if you're measuring learning, it implies people get stupid again. If you're measuring cognitive decline, it means they come back and get smart again if you just wait long enough. Right? Those are theoretically implausible in a lot of cases. We talked about one example of a truly nonlinear model is an exponential. That one has an asymptote that allows performance to stop at some sort of optimal level or suboptimal level. You can trick an exponential model by modeling log time. A quadratic effect of log time looks a lot like an exponential model in some cases. There is a reference in the textbook. There's an online thing that someone sent me a link to a long time ago called the Catalog of Curves. It's like a 200-page document that has 8,000 shapes in it. Whenever I have a problem that I don't know what it should look like, I go there and start staring at the shapes until I find one that looks like something that could be useful to me. If you can figure out how to parameterize it, you can figure out how to model it, add random effects within NL mixed or other types of packages. So there's lots and lots of choices out there. And the same is true for continuous variables that are not time. In each of these cases, because you'd be testing a fixed effect that could plausibly be negative or positive, you get to stare at the p-value that shows up on the output. That's a Weld test. Univariate Weld test is per term. If you want to test like a linear and quadratic together, for instance, that's a contrast statement with a multivariate Weld test. Model for the variance then, the other side. Which of these fixed effects of time needs its own random effect to go with it? Individual differences. Because these are variances that you're adding to the model, you can't stare at the Wald test that shows up on the output because variances can't be negative. Instead, this is where we do likelihood ratio tests. -2 log likelihood difference between nested models. If the model gets better, does -2 log likelihood go up or down? Down. Smaller is better. -2 log likelihood is known as deviance. Think deviant behavior is bad. You want less of it. So that means in terms of nested model comparisons, for instance, so this was on your homework, 6, I believe. So if we have a continuum here from empty model, that would be like the simplest model with just a fixed intercept. We might have something like linear time, and then quadratic time, and then all the way over here, the best possible model would be saturated. So we can talk about model comparisons relative to these things, And if we're in maximum likelihood, we could do them with -2 log likelihood tests. If we're in restricted maximum likelihood, we would have to do it with contrast tests with the wall tests. But in terms of saturated, saturated means is the best possible model for the means with respect to time. That means its -2 log likelihood should be the lowest. So if I'm comparing, say, a saturated means model to a quadratic time model, this quadratic time model can fit worse or not worse. It has fewer parameters, so it has to fit worse. The question is, does it do a good enough job such that it is not different than saturated? Not worse is the goal here. If we're starting from the other end, empty, we're going for better, because this is the simplest model you can have. Everything we add should make it better. If it doesn't, it's not better, and the simpler model would be preferred. The same is true if you think about the variance side. Random stuff. Random intercept. Random linear. Random quadratic. And what do I type here instead of saturated? Same idea, different word. There you go, unstructured. Same idea. Unstructured is the best. If you're testing some kind of random slope model, you are trying to approximate unstructured with fewer parameters. So everything is either going to be worse or not worse relative to it. Alternatively, if you start on the intercept side, everything is better or not better, because everything is more complex than intercept. You can also fit in things like plus AR1 in the R matrix. You can combine random slopes with some sort of R structure that allows for covariance among residuals. If it fits better, you keep it, and then you can test whether it's better enough relative to the right answer. When do you get the right answer? Saturated or unstructured? What's the magical data condition? Looking for a word starts with a B. Balanced. That's when you get the right answer back, otherwise known as absolute fit. If it's not balanced, you don't have the right answer, all you can do is start over here and just try to make it the best you can. Okay. So then you'd be at the point where we are at in our next unit here. Once you have determined how many random effects you need, then you get to start predicting them. So in this picture, for instance, this is what it would look like if we had a random intercept, a random slope of some kind, and we had a residual variance. We now have 3 different kinds of variability to be predicted. The random effects, intercept and slope, are between person things. There are 2 ways that people differ from each other, each of which can be predicted by person-level information, time invariant covariates. Anything that's at the same level, person level in this case, gets a covariance. At level 1, we still have E. E is, why are you off your line today? Person-level predictors cannot predict E by themselves. The only thing that can predict E is time-varying predictors. Why are you off your line today? It has to be because of what happened today, not who you are all the time. If you're on the other side of the spectrum where you're talking about fluctuation, the model for the means may or may not have anything with respect to time in it. The model for the variance likely does need to have something other than a random intercept. I recommend putting in the random intercept to the extent that you have a sizable interclass correlation, and then looking at what's left in R. -2 log likelihood can tell you whether or not you're heading in the right direction, same as before. So this picture here is meant to convey 2 different situations with respect to fluctuation data. On the left is what it would look like if you're using a random intercept. On the right is what it would look like if you're using some kind of R-only model, like an R-only Topolitz or an R-only AR1 or an R-only unstructured for that matter. then even though you don't have separate piles, you haven't used this between versus within idea to help build your variance model, you can still put any kind of predictor in that you have. It's just that you won't get a separate estimate of which kind of variability it predicts. That's the catch. At the end of the day, what random slopes and residuals do is they get put back together again to build V, which is one thing. You can predict anything in V with predictors at any level. All right. Questions on any of that? Okay. So why did we spend this entire semester on time? In a lot of other multi-level modeling classes, it's a week you spend on growth models and you're done, right? Or other longitudinal classes. You get latent growth curves in 1 week and then you get multi-level models in the other. And what would I say about that? Feel free to use my gestures. It's the same damn thing. It depends on whether you're using SEM software and you talk about random effects as latent variables, or you're using MLM software and you talk about them as random effects, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But either way, we start off with fixed effects of time because that anchors our means that are to be predicted, and that's what the random effects are varying around. Those random effects then form the piles of variance that the person level predictors have to predict. So if we know that people differ from each other, say in 3 ways, intercept, linear, quadratic, or intercept, slope 1, slope 2, that's at least 3 different things time invariant predictors have to do. If we know that people differ from each other in only 2 ways, that limits the logical possibilities of what time invariant predictors have to do. Those predictors then are specified as a function of which random effects exist to be predicted. And then time invariant predictors are supposed to capture whatever residual variance is left. So all of this is hinging on each other. So the fixed and random effects of time end up dictating what there is for your predictors to do. That's why they have to get that part right first. So random effects of linear time is the most common thing that people get taught, for instance, in latent growth curve models, but that's not the end of the story. A linear effect of time is only appropriate for certain kinds of longitudinal data. Not very many occasions when the emphasis is on change as opposed to fluctuation. For any other kind of data, you need something else. So that's big picture stuff, reminding you of some of the details then. So step 1, let's say that I'm interested in modeling systematic change and I think that I need some sort of polynomial. Maybe I have only 4 occasions, 5 occasions, something quadratic-y, that's good enough for me. In that case, we would go with something like this. Empty means random intercept, check the ICC. Anything less than 1, play ball. Fixed linear time, because it's a fixed effect, we can check the p-value. Because it's time, which is a level 1 predictor, we would talk about effect size via its reduction of residual variance, the level 1 residual. We could then, from that point, you could either add a corresponding random effect or you could continue building the fixed side of the model. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. What I tend to do is fixed then random in most cases. So we add the random linear. Because this is a variance, this requires a -2 log likelihood test. It does not get an effect size via R². Whenever you're adding random terms, you are reallocating variance to new piles. You are not accounting for it. You're not reducing it. You're not explaining it. We're making a new pile to be explained later. Fixed quadratic, back to time. Check the p-value as a fixed effect. That's more residual variance, but it's relative to your new model that has 2 types of random effects rather than the original one. Random quadratic, -2 log likelihood. That means we now have 3 kinds of level 2 variance, and you would continue with fixed and random terms as needed through whatever order polynomial you feel like. If I had a piecewise model, piecewise models I tend to go the other way for, because you really do need all of the pieces to describe the overall trajectory. So to me it makes sense to put them all in at the same time to do that. Because the linear and quadratics add on each other in a different way than the piecewise models do. So in this case, I'd still start at the same place, empty means random intercept. I'd throw in whatever fixed effects I need to describe the trajectory, so slope 1, slope 2, slope 3, whatever. Start with the random intercept. You can then talk about the fixed values, the fixed effects of the slope via their p-values. They reduce residual variance because they are time things at level 1. You can then add random effects of the slopes. Which one you start with first depends on the situation. They're not hierarchical, so there's really not a right or wrong way. But each one you would do with a -2 log likelihood test. And if it converges, I would continue to add them. If you get to the point where you can't have multiple random effects, you would have to pick which one you want to keep. The one that's biggest with respect to its size, if they're on the same scale, or one that has the best AIC and BIC. Smallest is another way. In this new lecture, I'm going to talk about slope reliability, which is another way to decide which effect should be random if you can't have all of them be random. And keep in mind that each of these piecewise slopes can be nonlinear as needed, such as in your homework 6. Whew. Questions? So one thing I threw in here is something that I get a lot of questions about and I spend a lot of time doing, is writing analysis plans. How many of you have either tried to write some kind of grant proposal or helped somebody try to write a grant proposal? Lots of you have, yeah. Fellowships, postdoc, pre-docs. Grants are a big deal in universities, particularly universities that are R-level universities like ours. And the best idea in the world will not get funded if you don't have a good analysis plan. You have to show them that you are going to know what to do with the data when it comes in order to answer the questions that you're posing. And sometimes people will write analysis plans in vague terms like, we're going to use SEM because SEM controls for measurement error and it controls for missing data and it handles everything. That's a crappy analysis plan because that says nothing about how that SEM benefit is going to apply to you. So these are the things that you want to think about when you're writing an analysis plan with respect to longitudinal data as well as in general here. First thing, what's the sampling design? If you have longitudinal data, how many occasions, how far apart in time are they going to be? Are they going to be balanced? Are the people grouped in any kind of meaningful way? Are you sampling children from intact classrooms or from teachers, siblings from the same family? Are you borrowing multiple sites? Are you studying some disease that's so rare that you can only get like 10 people in each state, so you have to get like 4 or 5 states? That's an instance in which you would have a 3-level design where you'd have to account for the fact that these people come from intact groups. So describing just how the data are structured and thus how the model needs to look. Is it 1-level, 2-level, nested, crossed? These are the things that we're getting into more examples of next semester. Are you going to have fixed or random effects for each of these sources of variability? And as well, this also applies too for the independent variables. So the type of DV that you have dictates how many levels you have in the model. That means, say, if I'm measuring something over time as an outcome, time is level 1, regardless of whether I have any other predictors at level 1. But each independent variable, you have to think about which level it's going to have variance at. If you have something like student level outcomes and you have student level predictors, to what extent are students from the same class or the same school alike in those predictors? You can test that empirically with an interclass correlation, but your analysis plan has to deal with the sources of variance in each of those. So then each of the variables, what are they like? And I'm not talking about assumptions of models, I'm just thinking about sort of the shape. Like for your outcome, is it going to be something to where you would be plausibly continuous? Or is it something that's never going to be continuous? Is it binary? Is it categorical? Is it likely to be skewed in some kind of way? Zero inflated or otherwise? You'll have to build a model consideration about that. Same thing on the IV side. We don't talk about distributional assumptions for IVs most of the time, but you do want to think about shape. So is more always better, for instance? If you're measuring something like how stress affects health, is there an upper limit at which no more stress can possibly make it worse? That would merit some kind of nonlinear trend for those IVs. And then what is the role of time in any of your time-varying variables? So for DVs, you would have this, but you also have to think about this for IVs. Individual differences. If you have any kind of individual differences in anything besides intercept, you have to think about it as a DV. So let's see, is it Alex, are you the one who wants to talk to me about your mediation model? Is that why I came up with you first with your name? Okay, see, I was close. So you're going to talk to me after class. How about we call that like now? What's your story? So we'll walk you through how to think about this in your example. Sleep duration, perceived what?
So a survey of an adolescent indicating how energetic they feel and how they feel.
Okay. Here, I'm not going to do a slash. I'm going to do a comma. Perceived stuff related to energy. And then what's on the other side? Physical activity. Okay. So this is sort of your classic mediation model, right? If you sleep well or you sleep a lot, you feel better, and if you feel better, you get off your ass and do something. Is that it? Basically? Okay. Yeah, I'm a health psychologist today. Hooray! Okay, that seems plausible to me. So in this case, physical activity, unquestionably a DV. Perceived energy fatigue, also a DV, also an IV. So this setup right here, I hate to tell you, you can't use proc mixed for. Proc mixed is only for DVs that are only DVs. You can't have variables that do both. So mediation models cannot be tested in proc mixed. It's fundamentally a univariate software. So we need a multivariate software. Do you know M+? You've been trying to learn it. Well, yes, so we're going to do M+ next semester if you would like to come visit, even if you can't come to the class. That's probably what I would do. Stata is another package. R, what is it? Levon, maybe? No? Not Levon? Damn it. Okay, well, something in R, I'm sure, which it can't do multi-level things? It cannot. Well, it's something in R, but not Levon. There's some other package, I'm sure. Okay, so that's step one here. So then how are these things being measured? You said these are adolescents? Mm-hmm. How many? 100. How often?
The study spanned 20 days.
20 days?
They continuously wore a wrist warrant actigraph, so we have day levels and physical activity, and then their energy fatigue measured 4 times a day.
Okay. So you have day level sleep. That one's pretty easy, right? Like the thing measures how long they were asleep, and that's a number, and that's it. Physical activity is continuous, so you have to come up with some sort of day level summary, potentially, or 4 times a day summary.
I have a couple different variables. One is the day level, one is an hour after they answered the survey.
Okay. Oh, that's the question. So let's talk about levels of analysis here. So in your case, let's do this at the top. Level 3 is people, 100 people, right? Mm-hmm. Level 2, I'm going to call day. You got 20 of those?
Yes.
Level 1 equals, I'll call this occasion, and you have 4 of those. How do you know when each person gets measured each day? Okay, so it is self-selected and unbalanced, right? Self-selected, that's important. Do you think that people that are like, buzz me at 6 a.m. are different than people that are like, I don't want to be bothered until noon? Okay, so the fact that time is being selected, that person level differences in the time schedule, that's a piece of information that you're going to have to pay attention to most likely. The fact that it's unbalanced, it's at different times, means that there's not going to be a ready answer key for anything that you're doing, which is both good and bad. It's good in that you never have to worry about proving fit, because you can't. It's bad because you never know if you have something that's good enough. But that's what it is. So the level at which you can show this relationship then. Sleep duration is a day level thing, right? Sleep. It is also a person level thing. Do some people sleep more than others? Most likely, right? How would you figure out how much variability in sleep is between persons versus within persons? Can anyone think of like a handy way to measure like between versus within? Does that sound familiar? ICC, right? This is a different kind, a different way of thinking about an interclass correlation, but to the extent that there is between person variation in sleep, that some people do sleep more than others, sleep is a level 3 variable. To the extent that some days you sleep more than you usually do, sleep is a level 2 variable. It is highly likely it's both in your case. Physical activity then, you said you're not sure what to do with it, you've got choices. How about this one, perceived energy fatigue? I'm going to call that PEF. Don't ever say that in your grant though, all right? You are not allowed to define acronyms. It pisses people off. You get one acronym per project, that's it. No more than that, but I'm just doing that because I'm running out of room here. So at some points in the day, are you more energetic than others? Pry. Some days, do you feel better than other days? Pry. Do some people have more energy like all the time? Pry. So that means that PEF has the potential to show an effect then at each level. So you have to decide then, given that sleep can only show up here, do you still want to look at the relationship between perceived energy and physical activity within a day? Do you think that sleep moderates that?
Yeah, it actually combined, you mean combining the energy and fatigue to be the day level?
Well, basically the question is, this part of the model can be answered at all 3 levels. Within a day, if you have more energy than usual, you may be more likely to get off your ass. On days you're feeling better, you may be more likely to do something that day, and people who have more energy than other people may run more, or whatever. You can argue about the direction of the arrows, right? But that's the story you're going with. So you can show that relationship in 3 different ways. So then the question then is this whole mediation chain. This mediation chain, though, is only logically possible at level 2 and level 3, because sleep is not available within a day. Sleep only happens once a day, at least in this story. So if you want to talk about mediation, you've got your between-person mediation, you've got your within-person across days mediation, but you don't have mediation possible at level 1. It's logically impossible. So all of the things that you've learned about mediation, direct and indirect effects, you get to do all of that at once at each possible level. And we haven't even talked about time yet, right? To the extent that people differ in when they are likely to engage in physical activity across the day, what time it is a level 1 predictor of PA. To the extent that maybe on weekends they're more likely to do it than weekdays or vice versa, time with respect to what day it is a predictor of PA. And this idea that people can self-select when you bother them, That is a person level thing because they set that time frame for the whole study, right? So you can find some way of operationalizing this idea maybe of morning people versus night people versus something like that, right? What is the earliest point at which you want to be bothered maybe? That's a simple way to do it. That's a level 3 thing. So time ends up being relevant at all 3 levels, just in a different way. And you'd want to show that these relationships hold even after you control for time of day, which day it is, and self-selection in the time frames across people. That sounds like fun, right? And,
I thought about asking a similar question.
well, the good news is that you already have the data, right?
Yes.
So you don't have to run the study. That's the good news. I don't think this is that complicated of a question. I'd say it's not a difficult question. It's complicated. There's a lot of parts. But when you're writing a grant to do this, or writing a dissertation, something, what are you writing?
So this is actually for an abstract
Okay, so the abstract can't be that detailed, but your level of thinking about it has to be. You kind of have to make a roadmap of all this shit to keep track of so that you can do it in a logical order and make sure that you haven't skipped anything to get to the one question, right, that we started with. That's a simple idea in theory. To get to it, though, is going to be a lot of steps. But the good news is that I think you know how to do all of them. All of you would know how to do all of them. Saying this is what we've been talking about. How to execute this final step in M+ to get multiple things predicted is something that you don't know how to do, but what you do know how to do is to do each piece of it. You can treat each of these things as an outcome. And look at the direct effects for now, and then we can talk about how to get indirect effects later. The other thing to think about that we haven't hit is just what are these variables like? I'm assuming that these are all something scaly. These are probably scales of some kind, right? Perceived something. Yeah, physical activity is something that's continuous. However, there's lots of periods of time where people aren't doing anything, right? So it is a zero inflated continuous. So a variable like that, you may have to think about as what I would call an if and how much. Like, are they doing anything as one outcome? And if they're doing something, how much are they doing? So this may actually split into 2 things, potentially, as one way of handling it. So lots of stuff to think about, and that is why I have a job and why I hope all of you will have jobs. Sound good? Yes. So we will pick up then with lecture 7B next time. Homework 7 is in progress. Office hours start now.